China says it will support an international review of the coronavirus pandemic when the health emergency ends. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. With more than 4.5 million cases globally and some 300,000 deaths, Chinese President Xi Jinping told the World Health Organization's annual assembly he supports a comprehensive review of the coronavirus pandemic. President Xi also pledged $2 billion to help fight COVID-19 and said when a vaccine is ready, it will be made a global public good. More than 120 countries backed a draft resolution calling for an inquiry into the origins of the COVID-19 virus. The resolution doesn't specifically name China, but for weeks now, the United States has accused China of suppressing information. President Xi defended his country's actions.
All along, China has acted with openness, transparency and responsibility. We have provided the information to the World Health Organization and relevant countries in the most timely fashion. We released the genome sequence at the earliest possible time. We shared our control and treatment experience. We've done everything in our power to support and assist countries in need.
Well, for more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He's a senior fellow with the Pangoal Institution and host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend. From McLean, Virginia, via Skype, John Sitilides is a geopolitical strategist and consultant to the U.S. State Department. And my colleague, CGTN's Nathan King, joins us from the White House. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Qinduo Xu, let me start with you. President Xi supports this international review of the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. He also announced a major contribution to the fight against COVID-19. Let's listen.
I would like to announce China will provide $2 billion of international assistance within 2 years to help with the COVID-19 response and with economic and social development in affected countries, especially developing countries.
So, Qinduo Xu, is President Xi under a lot of pressure to cooperate in this review of the origins of the coronavirus epidemic?
Well, not really. I think a lot of people would say this is, for whatever, like a pandemic, epidemic, every time after that, for example, like AIDS, SARS, Ebola, MERS, etc. After that, there will always be investigation. Mostly it's led by scientists and health workers to find out where is the origin and how a particular virus transmits from maybe animal to humans and from humans to humans. This is about really about the research to know more about the virus so you can find a better way to cure the disease. And also, most importantly, this investigation is not only about the origin, it's about the global response to this pandemic, whether there is something wrong, something from missteps, so we can learn from our own mistakes, so we can improve. Next time when there is a pandemic at this level, we can do a better job. And also, I want to point out that even the origin, we find out the origin of this virus either in Wuhan or in other cities around the world. It's not that Wuhan is to be blamed. This is a science and research. You want to find out the truth. It's not about to assign the blame to a particular city, to a particular country, or to a particular group of people. I think this should be clear. But unfortunately, before this, of course, there are a lot of blames, in particular from the United States on China, for being somehow the first city, the first place of the outbreak. This is a bit unfair, let's say, and partly because of this political consideration, because of the mishandling of the crisis. I think inside the U.S. there is this motivation to somehow, blame others, WHO or China, for this, what's happening in the United States. Imagine if the U.S. did a good job, say there's no big outbreak, only a few cases. Do people think there will be some, like a shift of blaming on others? No political blaming, probably.
Nathan, the Trump administration has been making some pretty serious accusations against China for several weeks right now, a couple of months really. This past weekend, Trump's top economic advisor, Peter Navarro, he accused China of hiding coronavirus and said that China was talking down the United States economy. Let's watch.
The Chinese, behind the shield of the World Health Organization, for 2 months hid the virus from the world and then sent hundreds of thousands of Chinese on aircraft to Milan, New York, and around the world to seed that. They could have kept it in Wuhan. Instead, it became a pandemic.
Pretty inflammatory comments there, Nathan. What to make of it?
Yeah, sending people around the world seed. You see what they're doing here. It's not just finger pointing, it's sort of loaded language as well. And look, there's one reason for it, especially if you look at what he says there, the timeline. Essentially saying that China didn't do anything for 2 months because basically the US put the limited travel ban from China at the end of February. So essentially discounting January and February. The trouble is the facts just don't sort of stand up to it. Even the Trump administration, for example, the head of the CDC, Robert Redfield, said in testimony last week to the Senate that he had been in contact with his opposite numbers in early January in Beijing. And continues to do so, and on a scientific level says there has been cooperation, although he did also say, but not the other stuff, meaning politically. And then you just have to look at the timeline from the WHO and Beijing and Wuhan, the early warnings in January, the sharing of the genome in the first, just after a week in January, the labeling of it a serious disease of international concern before a pandemic. So, you know, the timeline doesn't fit in. I mean, it is purely deflection. And, you know, obviously they have, you know, you can almost understand it from a political point of view because the White House has been found wanting. The domestic press are full of articles that essentially said they were warned again from everything from PPE to testing, and nothing has gone right. And unfortunately, the numbers bear that out. I mean, we are going to hit 100,000 deaths here probably before the end of May, and 1.5 million cases have been reached in the last 24 hours. So, you know, the US has been affected so badly by this. And obviously, with an election coming up, China.
John Sitilides, the rhetoric has been getting very heated over the last few weeks. President Trump himself has been very critical of China. In fact, at one stage last week, he threatened to cut off relations completely. What do you make of it? Why have relations deteriorated so badly?
Well, a couple of points, if I might, Anand, because first of all, you started out with President Xi's comments to the World Health Organization. And I think it's a welcome step from Beijing, in that we're looking now at rhetoric that focuses on best practices, on sharing information, and really moving forward in a way that is meaningful, both to try to determine the best way to deal with this pandemic around the world, and also eventually to be able to determine the actual origin and the way in which it spread around the world. But I do think that there is significant international pressure on Mr. Xi, and not only from the United States, but also from the 17+1 European Union member countries that are in partnership with China in Europe, countries such as Russia and Indonesia that are good allies of China. They're also calling for the investigation. So I want to make sure that we put that in proper context. As for the United States, to Nathan's point, I mean, really half of the damage done to the United States has happened in New York City and the New York metropolitan area. And most of the country has actually done quite well. Half of the counties in the United States don't have a single reported death from COVID. So this is really a New York disaster. And then what we've done is we've had governors who've taken, I think, a very misapplied, prolonged lockdown strategy and almost destroyed the American economy. The good news is that it looks like we may have hit the lowest point of the tanking of the economy. And hopefully June and the months ahead, we'll start to see whether it's the beginning of a U-shaped, a V-shaped, a W-shaped, or a swoosh-shaped recovery. but that will be on the mend in the second half and into 2021, along with the rest of the world. And that would be the ideal situation going forward.
John, I get your point about a lot of countries calling for this review, and I think China is calling it a review rather than an investigation, and that implies that nothing wrong has been done yet. It's a review. It's going back to look at what happened at the time. But I want to get to Nathan's point, which he made earlier on, and that is President Trump, and we've heard this from many commentators here in the United States, that President Trump is playing the blame game here. He's trying to deflect attention away from what many consider his own incompetence in handling the coronavirus here in the country.
I think there's a very healthy debate in the United States as to whether or not this has been a problem at the federal level or a problem, again, at the localized level. I mean, look at the example of China, Anand. The COVID breakout several months ago was not nationwide, right? Beijing and Shanghai report almost no cases and certainly very few deaths, if any. It was all localized in Wuhan and in Hubei province. And unfortunately now we see a lockdown in Jilin province, 100+ million people who are in lockdown, and hopefully that will pass quickly too. In the United States, anybody who looks at a county-by-county map will see, again, 40 to 60% of the cases and the deaths are in the New York City metropolitan area. Most of America has weathered this just fine, and the debate is quickly moving away from the health crisis to the economic crisis of a government-enforced lockdown of the entire labor force of the United States.
Sorry, can I just
go ahead,
can
Nathan.
I just interrupt here? Yeah. Because I mean, I take John's point, but the reason a lot of counties don't have states, don't have cases, John, is because, you know, obviously there are large parts of the country that don't have the population density, but also there's been social distancing. People have been at home, so you know that's a good thing, right? And obviously the economic cost is terrible, and you want to get the country open, but you want to stop a spike in cases. And the big fear now, as we're seeing in certain places that are getting more testing, and that may be because it's more testing, but it also could be because people are opening up a little bit too quickly and traveling around and infecting each other. We know so little about this disease still. So, you know, I wouldn't start saying that the US is sort of off the hook here, especially when you look at the number of cases and deaths. I take your point. They are in nearly the majority are in that very important northeast corridor, which is has a lot of density and a lot of economic activity. But that is not to say this is over. As we've seen in other countries, including China, it can flare up thousands of miles away.
All right.
It absolutely can.
Yeah, go very quickly, John. Go ahead.
Yeah, by no means did I intend to communicate that the United States is off the hook or this is over. But I do believe that the worst of this as a health crisis seems to be over. We may have waves in the future, but this is not a health versus jobs debate. We're going to have to balance this out. Yes. We're going to have to live with this pandemic possibly for several years if a vaccine is ever found. So we're going to have to learn how to balance an economy.
Okay. At this stage, I want to bring in Arthur Dong. He's joining us from Arlington, Virginia. Arthur is a professor at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. Arthur, great to see you. Last week, we talked with the former U.S. ambassador to China, Max Baucus. We had an interview with him, and I asked him about the trade deal that was recently signed between China and the United States. And did that trade deal now have a future? And he said that that trade deal, as far as he was concerned, was in serious jeopardy. Do you agree with that?
Well, it certainly seems, if you listen to some of the messaging that's emanating from the White House, that one of the things that the United States is considering is to place that at the center of this debate as to where the responsibility resides with this entire COVID, tragedy. And so China has signaled very clearly that it wishes to comply and wishes to continue to comply with the trade agreement that was signed in December, and they see no reason whatsoever to abandon that trajectory. But certainly this is one of many things that are coming on the table right now as part of this sort of political debate that is unfolding before our eyes as the blame game continues with this current administration.
Arthur, to what extent has the pandemic actually changed the terms and conditions of that initial trade deal that was signed, phase one, as it was called?
Well, what the United States seems to be indicating is that they are going to, in a sense, maybe walk away from some of the aspects and the momentum that was gained during, and the goodwill that was gained during this latest negotiation, and thus use this as an act of, in a sense, retribution against China for and trying to place greater responsibility on China for the origins of this pandemic.
Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and we're hearing noises like that too. And the sort of scenario that's sort of playing out, and this hasn't happened yet, but the hawks seem to have the upper hand. We talked about Peter Navarro, but there are others as well, like Matt Pottinger at the National Security Council and others, who essentially are saying, look, this gives us an opportunity to sort of fulfill our sort of, not decoupling, but sort of derailing the two economies. We could bring manufacturing home. Look at the supply chain. We didn't have enough ventilators. We didn't have enough masks. Let's make these things here, but also other things. Let's make sure that China doesn't get our technology. Remember that technology still away. Basically, don't waste this crisis and start delivering politically.
Yeah.
And they would jump on an excuse, for example, if China couldn't purchase the full extra agricultural products, to maybe say this is over and we're going in our own direction. The problem is, of course, that could cause huge economic damage just before an election. Think of all the farmers who would suddenly be recovering and then have no market again.
Qinduo Xu, what's the view from Beijing on this issue? President Trump, one of his biggest complaints, he says, he's frustrated with what he calls China's failure to buy more American products.
Well, for China, I think it is most of the people, including the government, are all for a stronger, let's say, trade relationship with the United States, because all the farm products, agricultural products from the United States, they are welcomed in the Chinese market as people consume more and more of high-quality products from overseas, including the United States. Why not? And there is this phase one trade deal. I think for China, China has this seriousness to implement the deal as much as possible, if not completely, because of the pandemic. We know there's a lot of damage to the Chinese market also. So I think the U.S. side also understands that, and so so far I do see both sides have this the will to continue with this phase one deal, even in the first half of the year. It is not well implemented, but it's due to this objective problem. And I agree with with my colleague that the Chinese market for U.S. products, the beef, agricultural products, etc., is huge, and there's a growing demand for that. I think this is good for China. This is good for the U.S. There's no reason not to continue with that kind of relationship.
John,
May I add to this? I agree with Qinduo here. I actually think that China has a very strong interest, unless we get into a very ugly series of retaliatory measures between the U.S. and China later in 2020. But China, first of all, has had to deal with the swine flu that has resulted in the culling of large numbers of pigs in China, and the United States is dealing with a crippled food supply chain, again, because of the lockdown and the way it's been implemented across the country. We're killing hundreds of thousands of cattle and pigs in the United States. This is a disaster. And so I think to a large degree, the Trump administration would like to see China continue with certainly the $200 billion in purchases. And as for Peter Navarro, he's not setting economic or trade policy by himself. And reports are very clear just the last couple of days. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin and Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, who's also, quote unquote, a hawk on U.S.-China trade, they're both continuing their trade talks with their Chinese counterparts. So that's moving along quite well, aside from all the political back and forth.
John, there was a Pew poll, and sometimes politics tends to overtake these things. There was a Pew poll that came out which said that Americans, by a 66 to 26 margin, hold an unfavorable view of China. And it's not just the pandemic that's driving this. It's about job losses. It's about the trade deficit as well. And I'm wondering to what extent China is going to be thrust front and center in this election campaign.
I believe it already is, and given the fact that the presidential election is only 5 months away, and remember, it's not just the presidential election. 1/3 of the Senate is up and the entire House of Representatives. I think there's a lot of concern about the direction of the U.S.-China relationship. As you note correctly, Anand, right now, China has taken a major hit in terms of U.S. pro-China sentiment, which has dropped by as much as 50% almost across the entire country. And I also see not just Republicans who are taking the lead on this, but a large number of Democrats have been very responsive to these drops in public sentiment. I think China will be one of the top three issues. Number one will certainly be the economy. If the recovery looks like it's starting to move in the right direction, I think that's going to be a big plus for Trump. But I think also Trump is going to try to make sure that Joe Biden isn't or can't be, quote unquote, too soft on China. And that's going to put Biden in a real dilemma with a part of his constituency as well. This will be a major component of November elections.
Nathan, what's your view on this? You cover this story on a daily basis, the relationship between the United States and China. I mean, we've already seen campaign advertisements from the Biden side, you know, these arguments going on about who's going to be tougher on China.
Yeah, I mean, you know, obviously Chinese don't vote here, so you know, it's a sort of easy way to go. And I think John's right in terms of deflection. I mean, U.S. President Trump, before COVID-19 hit, was really gearing up for re-election on the economy, and he was going to say how great it was, and there was a lot of proof that it was doing very well. The China trade deal sort of supports that. The Canada-Mexico trade deal supports that, and then suddenly the pandemic wipes it out. He hasn't got anything really to run on except judges and deregulation, which only works with his base. So what about the middle? And, you know, blaming China sort of helps with the economic argument, and it also helps deflect from his missteps on COVID-19 as well. The problem is, do you go so far on blaming China that you can't recover? Now, for the Democrats, they too, there's a lot of agreement on this. Because of China's rise, the U.S. is being challenged economically and in other ways as well. Look at the leadership vacuum around the world in organizations like WHO and other UN stuff. So there is a feeling that China is sort of rising, and that is creating problems in the Democratic Party too. And remember, the Democratic Party would like to sort of push China on other areas where Trump hasn't, for example, on human rights. So expect them sort of outbid each other a little bit in going into the election. The question is, will the American electorate really take notice? Their views on China and experiences on China are not that deep.
Arthur Dong, the United States Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, he predicts that the U.S. economy will recover, but it's going to take at least a year. This is what he said on the United States news program 60 Minutes. Let's listen.
This is a time of great suffering and difficulty, and it's come on us so quickly and with such force that you really can't put into words the pain people are feeling and the uncertainty they're realizing. And it's going to take a while for us to get back, but I would just say this: in the long run, and even in the medium run, you wouldn't want to bet against the American economy. This economy will recover. It may take a while. It may take a period of time. It could stretch through the end of next year. We really don't know.
What is your view on that, Arthur?
Yeah, I think Chairman Powell is just expressing caution, as he normally would. He's not a person who, in a sense, exaggerates or wants to cause alarm, but he's certainly offering some degree of caution as well as some degree of hope that we will eventually, come out of this current economic crisis. Now, I am in agreement with some of our previous speakers that this is not going to be a V-shaped recovery. It will be more like the Nike sign on the side of a Nike shoe, more like a precipitous drop, followed by a gradual increase in economic activity. Already, we see 36 states that have come back out of the lockdown. 14 more states, including New York, are considering staged, openings. And so, once all these states start to reopen, we're going to see the restoration of economic activity. It's not going to be like a light switch on/off, but more like, again, like a dimmer switch, where we see gradual restoration of light into the American economy. So I am cautiously optimistic, so long as we have active and aggressive fiscal stimulus, that the United States is going to recover, and perhaps, certainly with today's good news, with the announcement by Moderna that there is a very, very promising vaccine that's going into phase 2 trials this summer, and the preliminary results show a great deal of promise which certainly has stimulated today's activity on Wall Street.
That's right. The stock market closed very high today because of that news. And I like the idea of the Nike logo, the swish, I think it's called. John, former President Barack Obama, he's now entered the political fray and criticized President Trump for his handling of the coronavirus pandemic. President Trump, in turn, has responded. Let's listen to the both of them.
More than anything, this pandemic has finally torn back the curtain on the idea that so many of the folks in charge know what they're doing. A lot of them aren't even pretending to be in charge. If the world's going to get better, it's going to be up to you.
Look, he was an incompetent president. That's all I can say. Grossly incompetent. Thank you.
So, John, does this weekend mark the formal entry of former President Barack Obama into the election campaign?
This has been a gradual process, Anand, and I think much of it really hinges on how far the Justice Department will go in continuing to reveal what had taken place in 2016 and in the first months of 2017 by the Barack Obama administration against the Trump campaign, against President Trump. We see now the unmasking of Michael Flynn and the illegal leaks by Obama administration officials. They're accused. We don't know who exactly leaked. But I think all of these revelations are causing great strains for the Obama supporters in the Democratic Party. And of course, Biden's ability to run for president successfully hinges on continued admiration for President Obama. So I think that's a large part of the strategy. And I think President Obama is smart to try to change or to deflect the discussion from what happened under his administration to what he sees as the president's poor handling of this pandemic crisis.
Okay, we've got a few minutes left in the show. I want to get back to Qinduo Xu in Beijing. And Qinduo, the Chinese government says that they are going to test all 11 million inhabitants in the city of Wuhan. That's quite a task. Has that started? How is it going?
Well, it's already started for the basically like there are 11 million residents in Wuhan city proper. So you are going to test all of them in 10 days. On average, each day you are going to basically test 1 million residents. So at the very beginning, there's a very tough challenge. From the previous, from the results so far we have, it's very promising. Yes, they are going to do it, and mostly to find out this. We call it like asymptomatic, people who carry the virus probably, but they are not aware of. So you can have a true picture with this accurate testing of all those residents. Because so far there are some lingering cases. For example, the latest one in Shanghai is actually from a resident from Wuhan, from Hubei, who applied for a job, in Shanghai, and then they did the test and found out that he's positive over there. So there's still this concern, this suspicion about the situation in Wuhan. So that's why you want to have a sweeping test over there.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidoo in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.